So today, today afternoon, we are very happy to have Sumit Maskar, who will be speaking on claiming entitlements in neoliberal India, on Mumbai's will workers, the political mobilization of Mumbai's will workers around housing. And the core issue is, that we're looking at, is addresses one of the things which is happening across our cities, which is the transformation of economic activity. And in Mumbai, the mills, which were an iconic part of that particular city, started to decline. And then what happens to the mill workers? And Sumit then looks at that issue both in terms of the changing demands of mill workers themselves and the responses that they get from the system, which should make for an extremely engaging talk going forward. Sumit currently is the Associate Professor and Associate Dean of Student Affairs at the General School of Government and Public Policy at the O.P. University. And he's also a research partner at the Max Planck Institute for the Study of Ethnic and Religious Diversity. Sumit has his degrees from in a PhD from the University of Oxford, and he has now been sort of looking at policy issues for some time, given that he's been at the school. So we look forward to that presentation. Roughly about 45 minutes is the usual ground rules, and then followed by open questions. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you. Thanks, Partho, for the introduction and also for the invitation from both CPR as well as CSH. What I'm going to present is, what I'm going to present today is something I started as a doctoral project, and I'm like most of us, I'm just now trying to wrap up for a book manuscript publication. And this is a little, so I'm updating each of my chapters that were written like 7 years ago, and this is one of the latest updated chapter. In this one, as Partho explained, I'm looking at the issue of housing, and especially looking at the mill workers' housing question that has re-emerged since the 2005-2006 period particularly. And this is where the political mobilization has really picked up. And so far, 12,000 ex-mill workers have been benefited with subsidized housing, which is they have to pay about 10 lakh rupees, and they get a housing in pretty prime location in Mumbai city. Okay. But the broader theme that I have looked at in my work looks at the workers' response to joblessness. And how do they respond to joblessness? I look at in terms of going back to villages, reverse migration, and whether they can cope up with the new environment, both political environment, economic environment, as well as the social environment. Then I look at occupational choices and to look at the historical questions about whether social institutions play an important role in shaping up individuals' life chances. The last one is about the rehabilitation question, where I look at one part is about the housing, which I am going to present today, and the other is about alternative employment. So when the mill workers were kicked out of the mills, there was a provision for them to have alternative employment, alternative training, so that they can use those skills to find new jobs in Mumbai's economy. So what I have today is the question of housing. So here is the outline. I'll just explain like 2-3 questions that will be driving today's presentation, and then I have just a little information about the slides, about the data and methods. Then there is an overall context about the organized labor politics in the 1980s. And this is very crucial because this is something which has resonance across the globe. And also one can see these patterns in Mumbai city. Then I look specifically at the transformation of Mumbai city. And then I've come to the question of housing within the bigger rubric of rehabilitation. There are several aspects to rehabilitation, but housing becomes absolutely crucial for the current political mobilization. And then I just conclude with a few remarks. Okay. So the first question that I'm interested in looking in this particular presentation today is, okay, I don't know why it's going just constantly. I need to.
I have this problem all the time is just take off the automated PowerPoint. C'est le minutage automatique.
Ouais, ça m'a fait la même chose, c'était horrible.
Okay, oh.
I think you got...
Yeah, it stays. And okay, so the first question that I'm looking at is what factors explain the reorganization of ex-millworkers in post-industrial Mumbai? The second is what conditions enabled Mumbai's ex-millworkers in the realization of their entitlement for housing? And the last one, why did the neoliberal Indian state make minimal welfare provisions for the ex-millworkers? So these are three broader themes, and I'll return to them in the concluding remarks. Obviously, everyone sitting here knows where Mumbai is located and pretty much also familiar with the map of Mumbai. But what I'm interested in showing here is this little red circle that I have drawn. And this is where the textile mills have been located historically from mid-19th century. And this also remained my fieldwork during 2008 and 9. That was the longest time I have spent for fieldwork, and then I have been visiting regularly since then. Although the textile mills are located here, and I have also spent most of my time, and I continue to visit this part of the city, the mill workers have pretty much now, being dispersed to different parts of the city, and they do come back to the city once in a while, and so that will be remaining the center for political mobilization as well. So here is the data. I mean, my primary focus has been on the mill workers who lost their jobs from 1990s onwards, late 1990s especially. And I have restricted my sample from then onwards. It involved snowball sampling, then group discussions, non-participant observations. Then I have managed to get access to this monitoring committee minutes. And this monitoring committee was set up from 2005-06 onwards. It started functioning. And every month, the committee met to discuss different kinds of issues around mill workers' housing, their claims, their dues, the issue about redevelopment of the textile mill lands. And this run from 2006 to even current, but I have access till only 2018. And this is where I'm pretty much going to stop, and I'll explain the reasons why I stop at this period. And then there is a survey data which is not necessarily used for this particular paper. But there is a large-scale survey data of those people who are based in the city and in the village, and then there are interviews. All right. As I started talking about the 1980s, and this is very crucial also for understanding the current housing question of Mumbai, and that's why I have to go back to that particular period about 1980s. As we have pretty much been aware of through different literature, that 1980s was a very crucial period for the organized labor unions, for organized labor politics, where the state came absolutely heavily on the workers. In England, the miners' strike is the classic example, but as well in the United States and in other parts of the world. In Bombay, the 1982-83 strike also resonated with these patterns as well. Now, what does all of this means eventually, gradually, when the state is clamping down on the organized labor politics, and then you have very decline in labor politics, and further you have the closure of factories from late 80s onwards in different cities in the country. So you have Ahmedabad, you have Kanpur, you have Bombay, you have Kolkata, you have Coimbatore. So you have these big industrial cities which actually are undergoing massive transformation, where organized manufacturing industries are closing down in a big way. So scholars working on different cities have argued, say for instance, in the case of Ahmedabad, Jan Bremen has argued that this particular decline in the labor politics has resulted in the disappearance of spaces for social cohesion, where workers from diverse communities would come and mingle with the trade union spaces, which allowed them spaces for social cohesion. In the case of Kanpur, Chitra Joshi has argued that this particular pattern of the decline of organized labor politics resulted in the death of political culture. As far as Kolkata is concerned, Nandini Guptu has shown that as among the jute mill workers in Calcutta, there is a sense of fear and loss of power and capacity. So this is what the experience of organized labor workers has been. Now, what does all of this have implications for the laborers themselves? And in which direction they would go once the organized labor politics space actually begin to diminish. So one argument that came up in a big way, and this is argued by both Chitra Joshi as well as Jan Bremen in the context of Ahmedabad and Kanpur. And they argued that the retrenched workforce, the organized retrenched workforce, took refuge in communal formations, which resulted in the participation of anti-Muslim violence in both the cities. But Nandini Gupta argues that in her case in Calcutta, it was more about disillusionment with the democratic politics itself, where the workers begin to see politics only merely as a form of patronage, and the democratic essence of it, where workers could bargain for their rights, was beginning to diminish. Some of these patterns have similarities with the case of Bombay as well. However, what we have very interesting pattern that the Bombay mill workers show us is the reorganization after the closure of factories. So in none of the bigger industrial cities, the workers come again and reorganize as ex-factory workers. And this is what makes the narrative of Mumbai textile workers very interesting, where the workers actually reorganize. There are different forums through which they begin to reorganize. So these are not traditional unions which were active among the mill workers historically. Some of these unions actually begin to emerge only in 1989. Some of the other unions which were active only start in 2004, 2005. So these are these labor organizations, one might call, rather than one can call them union or organizations, but these kind of collectivities only are the newer ones. So the traditional ones pretty much have been in the decline. And it is around the question of housing, alternative employment, yellow ration card. This is so that they can have access to the cheap food grains. And then there is training for mill workers' children, new forms of training so that they can get incorporated into the new jobs that are emerging in Bombay. So there are wide-ranging plans for rehabilitation. I focus on the housing question because this is one thing which workers kept insisting, and as well this was my own fieldwork observation that triggered the political mobilization, both in the city as well as in the villages where workers have migrated. So, and the migration has been very strong in the Konkan region because this was one of the major labor supplying region, and the other is Western Maharashtra. So both of them have contributed historically in terms of labor supply to the Bombay city and also particularly to the textile industry. Now, as far as the city is concerned, as I have been talking about, that there is Bombay, there is Calcutta, there is Ahmedabad, and then there is Kanpur. And all of these cities were known for either cotton or jute textile mills. But Bombay, the scale of workers in Bombay have been extremely high in comparison to other industrial cities. The history of the textile mills in Bombay goes back to the mid-19th century when the first textile mill was started. But coming to the very recent time and again to the 80s, which actually is very important to understand the current housing question, you have roughly 250,000 workers in the early 80s who were working in the textile mills in Mumbai. And this is the time for this historic 1982-83, the 18-month textile strike, which was led by Datta Samant. But this was effectively put down by the state together in collusion with the mill owners as well as the recognized trade union. But what you have a situation is that only in the 1990s you have the permanent closure of textile mills. So 1993, one textile mill closed down. But 97, you have the trend that begins where there are roughly 58 textile mills in the center of Bombay where I've shown. And one by one, you have the closure of these textile mills. And 2006 is the time when the last textile mill closes down in Mumbai city. Now, all of this obviously has major implications for the formal sector employment. Up to the 1991, you have 35% of the workforce that was engaged in the former sector employment. But gradually, as the textile mills closed down, the proportion of formal sector has gone down, but you also have closure of the engineering industries, the automobile employment has gone down, the tire manufacturing sector has gone down in terms of its share in employment. But parallelly, what has happened in the Bombay from the 80s also, is the growth of what is known as the service sector economy. So you have banking, insurance companies, the information technology enabled services, the BPOs, the call centers, the high-end entertainment centers. So all of these all of these companies, which is part of the service sector economy, have been also growing parallelly. Interestingly, what happens for the city of Bombay, given its geography, the South Bombay, which is where the business district was historically located, had to be then expanded. And this is where the contestation over the space begins for the city of Mumbai. And then you also have a time in 1990s pretty much where the real estate prices of the city go up extremely high. And so this is the part of Bombay that becomes extremely valuable, which is the central Bombay, which is where the textile mills have been located historically. Now coming to the 1980s period, and especially the Bombay city context. So 1980s, we have this major strike, as I have just mentioned. Now what happens after the strike, which is very crucial for the current housing question. So once the strike is over, the mill owners demand to the state that we have suffered massive losses, and the only way they can restart the textile mills is by selling parts of the textile mill land in the real estate market. So the request originally was that they sell a small part of the surplus, what they call the surplus mill land, into the real estate market. And that money, whatever they earn by selling in the real estate market, will be used for starting the mills again, as well as to pay the workers' dues. And so this was the main argument that was made. Obviously, as it happens, then the workers' unions were pretty much around, and they were very strong and effective, at least to the extent at stalling this particular demand. So up till the late 1980s, this demand is not met by the state. So the state is still not granting them the permission to sell this little portion into the real estate market so that they can use this money to restart the textile mills. It takes about 1991, which is when Sharad Pawar, who is now the important man for the current political scenario in Maharashtra, he becomes the Chief Minister of Maharashtra, and he grants the permission for the selling of what is known as the surplus land within the textile mill premises, which could be used for real estate purposes. Okay. Now, one thing I would like to mention here is that all these land were reserved for industrial purpose only, which means the land could not be used for any other purposes. And that was the restriction on the land use, especially for the textile mills, and I'm sure for many other cities as well. So this particular relaxation was done in 1991, but then they made a particular kind of formula for allowing the real estate development. The first part was that if they go for selling this textile mill in the surplus land in the real estate market, then 33% of that land will have to be given to the MHADA, which is the Maharashtra Housing Area Development Authority, and which would then construct low-cost housing. Then the second part, second one-third, would go to the Bombay Municipal Corporation, which would use the land for civic amenities, hospitals, schools, playgrounds, and the remaining one-third would then be used by the mill owners for real estate development. There is one rider in this entire formula, is that if the only 10% of the mill land is used for such purposes, or less than 10% of the mill land, then there is no need to share the land with either MHADA or BMC. So the mill owners can directly go to the use that whatever share in the real estate market. I mean, it is not surprising then that almost all mill owners who use this particular provisions never ended up submitting any portion of land either to the MHADA or to the BMC. But obviously there were violations in the way this provision was used. And the classic case is that of the Phoenix Mill. So for all those who have been to Bombay City and who probably have been to the Phoenix Mill compound, So that particular construction has been in complete violation. And one of the most glaring violations of that particular mill compound was the bowling alley. Because the pretext for the creation of bowling alley was that this will be created for the workers' recreation center. And obviously, even then when it was created, it was pretty expensive. Even it is now expensive for the workers, but then also it was extremely expensive. And given these irregularities in the way this particular provision was used by the mill owners across the city, and then all these violations which were reported to the government by various stakeholders, especially the trade unions, it had to be revised again.
Can we ask clarification?
Yes.
Question? You say if only 10% of the land is used for development, like I'm a mill owner,
Yeah.
I decide to use 8% of my land for real estate, not 33%.
No, sorry. I think of the total, so, sorry, I mean, let me just clarify this again. So, this idea is called surplus mill land. So, within the factory premises, they would show that this is a surplus mill land, a little corner in the mill land, which is not used for the factory. But if we sell that little surplus land, then we can actually use the money to restart the textile mills. So, the mill lands were pretty huge for each factory.
So without destroying the mill?
Nothing. Yeah, you're not destroying. So this is like, if this is the entire mill land, that particular corner, they would just sell for the real estate market. Now, within that corner, that has to be divided in 3 parts. One for the mill owner, one for the BMC, and the another for the Mahada. Okay? But if the total land is mere less than 10% of the mill land of the owner, then they don't have to do the land sharing. So as you rightly said, if it is like total, that surplus land which is used for the real estate market, if it is only 8%, then they don't have to share anything with the Mahada or the BMC.
That was a change, right? Because the first...
Yes, so that's what I'm coming to now.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Right.
So that was 1991, and that's what I reported, that this was the provision. People used it, mill owners used it. One of the classic example is that of Phoenix Mill, and they actually went through various violations of that provisions. And because there were violations, there was a rethinking about this particular formula. And then what you have is the revision in 2001. And this was, again, this is known as Development Control Regulations. Yeah. Yeah, so I'll come to that. Yeah. So, I'll come to that when I discuss the housing part in a bit. So we have these 1991 provisions. Mill owners use it. There are massive violations. Then we reach 2001. Obviously, there are several committees which are, doing reports about these violations and what can be done as far as the new provisions are concerned. So one of the big changes that actually happened in 2001 is that the state this time allows that the entire mill lands could be now sold into the real estate market. So the first, one of the biggest problem for the land going into the real estate market was that this land was reserved for industrial purpose only. Okay, so in the history of then the mill lands and the way land has been used, this is a major change in 2001, where now the mill owners could sell the entire land in the real estate market. So now they can effectively shut down the factories and sell their land in the real estate market. And this is what actually gave a big push to the textile mill closures in the city. But they did not just do that. Then they made modifications to the make modifications to the 1/3 formula, but they defined the open space. And this is what the interesting part has been, that they said the land should be divided, the open space should be divided 1/3 to the BMC, 1/3 to the Mahada, and the remaining 1/3 for the mill owners. Now, what constitutes open space? And this became a subject of big debate. Should the structures which has the textile mill machines, different kinds of offices, because they will be demolished after the closure. So should the entire patch of mill land should be considered as open space, or you have these little open spaces inside the factory, there are grounds maybe, then there are passages to go to different departments. Should that be considered as open space? Okay. Now this obviously went to the court of law because this became a matter of dispute. And in the dispute, what the argument was made, and this was especially the environmentalists, the Bombay Environment Action Group, also became party to this particular legislation, against this particular provision, and where they argued that the city has very few open spaces, and which is extremely needed. And in comparison to other bigger cities around the world, the city of Mumbai has very less open space. And this particular land, which will be freed up after the closure of textile mills, could be then used to, remove that particular gap of open spaces. The High Court ruled in the favor of the Environmental Action Group, and also then by extension the mill workers, where they held that the original purpose of this land was to run factories, and then if the mill owners are no longer interested in factories, and then they are interested in closure, then the entire land has to be considered for the 1/3 sharing formula. Obviously, this then matter went to the higher court, in the Supreme Court, and where the state government stood up in favor of the mill owners, and they argued that this particular provision of open space has been done deliberately to encourage the mill owners to develop the land in a most effective way. And once the state itself stood in favor of the mill owners in the Supreme Court, then obviously then the ruling was pretty much going to go in the favor of the mill owners, and which is what happened. And in 2006, the ruling came out, the result of which was that earlier 33% of the land would have been given to each stakeholder, whereas now what happened is 85% land went to the mill owners, 7.5 to the BMC, and 7.5 to the Mahada. Now the trouble here is that because we are talking about open spaces and sometimes very tiny passages, then in some textile mills the actual proportion became absolutely negligible, because you could not use that particular spaces for construction of any form of housing or any kind of, even the BMC could not use it for any gardens or school. So it became meaningless in several textile mills, but it was still, some parts could be used in several textile mills. And interestingly enough, whether one can call it as it was a pressure of the then labor organizations or to avoid kind of troubles, they actually included a provisions for housing. Now within the provision for the low cost housing, they decided to reserve 50% of the land for the Mahada. Within the total divisions, the 50% of the land which is given to Mahada for the housing of the mill workers. Okay. Then there was a provision for alternative employment, and most importantly, they had a provision for a monitoring committee, which was headed by a retired Chief Justice from the High Court in Mumbai. And so this was one of the troubles, as I discussed with the 1991 provisions, where the rules were made, but the provisions were pretty much not followed. In fact, there were massive violations in those provisions. So here you have a monitoring committee which was then responsible to look after the redevelopment of the textile mill lands, to look after the dues that were given to the workers, and then to also look at different provisions which were mentioned in this particular development control regulations of 2001.
So
And
just to clarify, 50% of 7.5%?
yes, yeah, exactly, yeah.
And another clarification, this new land sharing formula with mill owners who are getting 85% of the land is quite a drastic change between 1991 and
Yeah,
2001.
so earlier it was 33, 33, 33
So what was the main argument
in the open spaces.
So this considered like all spaces or open spaces? This 85%?
No. So what proportion of land should be shared? Which land should be shared with Mahada and BMC?
Yeah, I know, but from 33 to 85%, it's a huge
Yes.
drastic change.
Yeah.
What was
So for example, this building is, this is a factory premises. When you enter the building, there is a passage to park the car, to walk around. So that was considered as open space. Not this one where the factory walls were created. So yeah, and so that was divided into 33, 33 and 33.
and in 2001 they included the
No. The original formula for 33 was only for the surplus mill land, which means this is a huge factory, and the corner there is a surplus land which otherwise is not required for the factory.
But in 2001
Yeah, so 2001, what they did, they kept the same formula, except they added one rider is only open spaces should be divided. The open space argument was not there part of the 1991 provision.
And so, sorry, what happens to the rest of the mainland where structures are?
Okay, maybe it will get confusing. So let me explain this, okay? So again, we'll come back to this building itself. So as you enter this particular premises here, there is car parking, okay, and then there is this building. So what happened in 1991 is as soon as you enter, let's say the mill owners decide the car parking is a surplus land and we want to use that for real estate development, okay? So what the government said, yes, you can use that as long as it is less than 10%, you don't need to share with us, okay? If at all it is more than 10%, then that particular car park has to be divided into 3 parts, okay? And that is surplus mill land, okay? So that's, and the land sharing formula remains same even in 2001. Except now, what happens is that there is a little rider where they say that only open spaces should be considered for land sharing, which means the building where we are now, that remains with the mill owners. Only the open spaces are to be further divided. So passages you can measure, they further have to be divided into 1/3, 1/3. So right now, when we move from 1991 to 2001, we are not talking of surplus mill land anymore. We are talking of the entire mill land. And now the trouble was, how do you divide that land as far as this development provision is concerned? Okay, and here where there was a situation where they added a particular criteria where only open spaces should be divided. So now again, obviously, as we know that in many of these premises, what was considered as an open space, like let's say the car park here, would be very tiny space.
So that's the trick actually.
Yeah, so the trick, it was trick.
So all building get shared between the different.
Yeah, so the building share is completely gone to the mill owners. Only the remaining spaces where you can park or whatever, there is a little passage to walk around, only that got divided. So mill owners not only got share within the factory buildings, but also they got 33% within the share in that particular part.
And they were free to redevelop that factory building.
No, they can actually do anything. That was the main part in 2001. They could do anything with the building. In fact, one of the reservations for this land was it could be only used for industrial purposes. 2001 changes that. 2001 says you can actually do anything with that premises, which effectively means real estate business because that was the big thing in the city. So, and obviously many of these, I mean all of them pretty much went for shopping malls, high-end entertainment centers, big bazaars, but also housing complexes, office spaces. So they were free to develop the land in a way they wanted. There were no restrictions, unlike earlier. Earlier the restriction was industrial purpose. So even if factory closed down, the land could be only used for another kind of factories. Okay, and that reservations, once that is removed, then actually it's much more easier for the mill owners to shut down the factories. And also it gives them more incentive to shut down. Because if the land was to be reserved still for the industrial purpose, then it still does not provide much incentive to the mill owners. Okay. So that's the change between 1991 to 2001, where mill owners end up acquiring more share of the land and leaving very little for the housing, low-cost housing, and to the municipal corporation. But the only thing which is very important for today's presentation is the monitoring committee here, which was not present in the 1991 provision. But here you have a retired High Court judge who sits on a committee and whose approval is extremely necessary for different kinds of redevelopment plans that were going to take place on the textile mill lands. And it is here that you have monthly meeting of the textile, for each textile mill, where the mill owner representative would come, and much later the workers representative, they demanded that even they should be allowed to sit into these particular meetings. And then there were other stakeholders. So gradually the municipal corporation got involved in these meetings, labor commissioner got involved, the MHADA office got involved. So different kinds of stakeholders of this particular land got involved. So originally the first meeting, if you look at the minutes, it's only the mill owners, and then there is this representative union, the RMMS secretary sitting. So there are just 2 or 3 people sitting in those meetings. But as you go gradually from 2006, 8, because 8 and 9, so 9 you have elections in the country. the general elections as well as the Maharashtra State Assembly elections. So by then the political mobilization is pretty much on its peak, and then the mill workers, are able to go through these meetings and pressurize the monitoring committee chairperson to rule in their favor, some of these things, and I'll just come to one or two of this. But let me just focus on the housing, and I'm happy to talk about other stuff in the meetings in the Q&A session. So the housing, as far as the housing thing is concerned, as I said, it has its roots in the 1982 strike, whereby the mill owners started first time demanding that they should be allowed to sell the little surplus portion of the mill land in the real estate market. And then that obviously got transformed into 1991 Development Control Regulations, which was further amended in 2001. And this is where in 2001 you have this little provision that is made for the housing for mill workers. And this is what the labor organizers pick up, these particular provisions, and then they start mobilizing the workers. So this is already 2006, the last textile mill is closed down. In many textile mills, the worker have received their dues, they have to vacate those premises already. And so this housing question then becomes very important for remobilization of workers, which has not happened in other industrial.
If they did not receive their dues, were they allowed to continue to stay? If the worker had not been paid his dues, did he have the right to stay on?
Yeah, I'll just explain that, yeah. So there are two kinds of questions that I'm dealing with here in terms of housing. The first question is about those workers who used to live on those premises which were provided by the mill owners. So there is a housing provided by the mill owners, which is roughly 6,000, that's what figures I have acquired. And it was only 16 textile mills after 15/8 which provided the housing. And then the second question is about this whole thing that I've been talking about, acquiring land for mill workers housing. So these are two separate questions. So let me deal with the first part, and I think the question will be clarified as I explain this part. And as I think as history, I'll just spend just a couple of seconds on this one, is the history of mill worker housing pretty much goes back to the late 19th century where Bombay as a city had to confront this bubonic plague, and there was a massive crisis in the urban infrastructure. And you have Bombay Improvement Trust, which was given this particular responsibility to look after this particular problem of a plague and then suggest some measures. So one of the measures was obviously housing for the poor, because this was supposed to be the main source of plague for the city. And there were only few mill owners who actually took up this particular provision for housing in late 19th century, and it went up to early 20th century. Now, as far as the mill workers are concerned, it has been historically the case, and this is also the case with all the factories across the country, which either they are private or public, who provide housing to its own factory workers or workers in general. That the moment that person ceased to be a worker or an employee, that employee had to vacate the housing premises. So once the worker gets his or her dues, or in many cases even without the dues, once they cease to be workers, then they have to vacate the factory premises. But in many cases without the dues, they continue to stay. Okay, and this was one of the reasons they actually cleared the dues, so that they also wanted to get rid of the workers from the housing premises. So here is a situation where workers are expected by law historically that once they cease to be an employee, they have to vacate the premises. But what happens with the Development Control Regulations in 2001, and then you have several amendments that are added gradually, is that this particular provision says that the workers do not have to vacate the premises, and they can stay as long as the building is in decent condition. And even when the building goes for redevelopment for whatever reasons, they have to be given temporary accommodation somewhere, and whenever the building is constructed, they have to be rehoused in the newer buildings. So that was the provision. So this was most effectively visible in the housing which was provided by the mill owners. And because this was the provision which clearly said that they do not have to vacate the premises. And all those workers who were on the job roll as on 1st January 2000, then they do not have to vacate those particular premises. And interestingly, then obviously there is a conflict between these two laws. So there is a new provision which is passed by the government of Maharashtra, and then there is the Central Employees Act from the central government, which means that you have to vacate the premises. So what the mill owners did, particularly in the extreme south Bombay, that they used the provisions which was created by the government of India to file cases against those workers who were not vacating the premises. So as you said rightly, till they were not cleared with the dues, they were staying there. The moment they cleared the dues, then they were served notices to vacate those particular premises. And in fact, the housing premises becomes very interesting, where they were also forced to take up whatever kind of settlement they were given, because they were like, you are anyway no longer an employee and this factory is going to be shut down. So it's a little complex that way, but let me just focus on this housing part. So obviously there is a conflict between these two laws, one which is passed by the Maharashtra government and the other is by the government of India. And the mill owners used the provisions in the government of India to file cases against the textile mills. And in one of the cases, mill workers are actually then arrested and sent to jail. And this is where again the political mobilizations of mill workers in the different kinds of neighborhoods become important. And this is also very interesting, where political leadership from different political parties who grew up in these particular neighborhoods, then actually there is a political consensus from Shiv Sena to Congress to NCP to BJP and all kind of political parties that the mill workers' housing should be retained and they should not be kicked out of the mill. And in this particular case where the mill workers were arrested, the workers actually went up to the chief minister and requested him to use the special provision and special powers that he had to grant pardon to the arrested mill workers. And given the political situation of the time, the chief minister then was Vilasrao Deshmukh. He used this particular provisions as chief minister to release the workers from that particular jail. And once workers actually are released from the jail, that actually becomes a turning point for the mill workers to retain the housing that they had. And not only that, they actually go back to this particular monitoring committee to show that they were in the occupation of those particular premises as on 1st January 2000, and therefore they should get back their housing. And obviously, as the provisions are made, they actually appeal to the monitoring committee, they make applications, and as the rule suggests that they have to be given back their premises, the mill owners try to do the delaying tactics of they use certain kind of excuses that they need to go to the High Court to have clarification on this law, that law, and then they keep arguing that the central government law, they follow the central government law because it's a heavy industry. So there are different kind of arguments that come up. But what the committee rules are saying that the Maharashtra, although the land sometimes may belong to the central government because of various ownership, the development rights are with the Maharashtra government. And if they want to do the redevelopment as per the provisions laid out in the new development control regulations, then they also have to follow the provision of workers' housing. That they cannot use the provision of real estate development which is laid out in Maharashtra government development control regulations and use central government law to actually get rid of the workers from the housing. And once this particular fact is established that all those mill workers who were living on the factory premises do not have to vacate, or even those who were living there as on 1st January 2000 can claim back their housing, then there is a massive turnaround in these particular meetings in 2008, 9, 10, and one worker actually begin to gain back their housing, which they had surrendered originally as a result of loss of jobs or retrenchment or voluntary retirement scheme if they have adopted any. Obviously, one of the things that the mill owners try to do is to delay this particular handover of the housing. And it is not just mill owners who are private, even the nationally owned the National Textile Corporation, even they would delay the handover of these particular rooms to the mill owners back to them where they lived before. And one of the ways which actually state try to enforce this particular provision is by issuing something called stop work notice. Now stop work here means stopping the redevelopment of the work, of the real estate work. And the stopping of this particular real estate work meant that this would also delay the development process, but that would also increase the cost of redevelopment. And this is something the mill owners or the real estate development could not afford to. And they had to just wrap up this particular matter by then handing over the housing premises. Now, the second part of the housing here, and I'm pretty much done, I mean, this is the last slide here, is the 50% share of the Mahada. So, of all the 33% division I have explained so far, 133% belong to the Mahada for low-cost housing. And within that low-cost housing, the half of that particular portion was meant for the mill workers' housing. But as I've already shown that the overall share of land has reduced significantly for the low-cost housing and then effectively also for mill workers' housing. It was a big challenge in front of the state as well as for the labor organizers. The labor organizers also tried to make it a very political issue by asking the state to also include those workers who were on the job roll on 1st January 1981 and who lost their job because of the 1982-83 textile strike. That remains still a matter of, so the state government accept those forms, but whether they really will do anything, let time alone will decide. But even those mill workers who lost their jobs, there were about 90,000 something workers. So far only 12,000 flats have been distributed. But it was around this particular issue actually that elections after elections, from 2007, that was the municipal corporation elections, till 2012, all the municipal corporation elections, then the state government, and also the parliamentary elections. So around these particular elections, the mobilization was extremely high, and they were able to pressurize all the political parties to accept this particular demand. So once they approach all political parties, and also there is a longer history of mill workers, there is this, it becomes a very morally sensitive issue to not actually address the mill workers because there is this claim about their participation in the independence movement, the formation of Maharashtra, and they have been at the forefront of social and cultural movement. So they use that particular moral capital to argue for these particular demands. And interestingly, in both rural as well as urban areas, the mobilization was pretty interesting. But once they start distribution of flats, now this is the last point here about once the demand is made, they agree and they also construct the flats. Now, how do you distribute the flats? And this became a really point of contestation where many of the unions said that each and every worker should be given the housing and you could give in whatever order they wish to like. But what the state government said, no, we cannot do that. We are going to follow a lottery system. And once lottery system is introduced, then that actually is one of the key reasons for the decline of their mobilization. So in that particular period from 2008, 9, 10, you have roughly 12,000 flats that were distributed up to 2014 when the BJP Shiv Sena took over the power. And during the last tenure of the Shiv Sena BJP, not even a single flat was distributed, although the construction had taken place. Now I keep coming across news where 5,000 flats will be distributed in December, in January, in February. So we don't know whether that will happen. But that also depends upon the political potential of the mobilization. So the moment all these political parties realize that there is a little bit of potential that they might disturb little bit of power. They are not extremely influential. I mean, to be honest, in terms of electoral strength, they have pretty weak electoral strength, but they have a capacity to influence opinion in terms of making it anti-state, particularly the ruling party. And this is what no ruling political wants. And what is more important is in municipal corporation elections, the very tiny number of votes can actually change the power. And therefore, if these mobilizations go around and if any political party actually decides to say that they don't want to give them housing, that will actually cost them quite a bit. So if for all the official reasons, each and every political party says they are with the mill workers and they are very much in favor of all the provisions that are mentioned in the 2001 development control regulations. So as a matter of compromise, what the last government also did, like the Congress government only, is that there was this flats that are constructed for various reasons, for the housing for the poor or for because of the displacement of development projects in far away from Mumbai city. And this is part of the Mumbai Metropolitan Regional Development Authority, and they argue that these flats also will be part of the distribution. And however, not much distribution also has taken place. So for now, at least for the last 5 years, as far as the housing question is concerned, not much has happened. And my own guess is that also overall the mobilization has been pretty going down since 2014 already. And since they do not organize in the same enthusiasm and capacity any longer, political establishment do not necessarily feel the pressure to carry on the distribution further. And that's the reason so far only 12,000 flats have been constructed. And in concluding, what I'll say is that the demand for housing and alternative employment has actually provided conditions for the remobilization of ex-mill workers, which, as I said, is unique to Mumbai city, and other industrial cities have not witnessed this particular phenomena. Now, as far as neoliberalism is concerned, you can see that this is one of the cases where neoliberal policies are implemented, but without using any coercion. The classic way of looking at neoliberalism is where the state uses coercive mechanism, but here they are continuing with the neoliberal development model, and yet without using any coercive mechanism. The third conclusion here is that the electoral compulsions and the delay in real estate development, which can also mean that the delay in accruing the profits for the real estate developers and the mill owners, then can actually force them to give minimal welfare provisions for the workers. And yet what happens here is that there is a collusion between the ruling state as well as the mill owners, which has also meant that only a tiny minority of mill workers have access to the housing provisions. Thank you.